Okay. All right. Well, welcome to the Goodwood celebration. And let's double check. Can you hear me, Keola?
I can. You sound great.
All right. Yeah, because I turned my Zoom screen off so I can read my script a little bit more here. So, and I'm Glenn Ahrens. I'm going to be one of your co-hosts. I work for the Oregon State University Extension Service as a forester, but I'm also a member of the Build Local Alliance. And I think if you would share the screen for the title slide and then go to the Build Local Alliance mission slide, if you would, Lynn. So first, what is the Build Local Alliance? Well, we are a group of folks that are all looking at connecting good wood from the forest to the trees to the people that work with wood and the end use of the wood. And we are all kind of in pursuit of our own goals and aspirations around good wood. And the Goodwood celebration we put together, we originally wanted to get together in person with all of you, maybe in a fun establishment for eating and drinking at the same time, but this is our substitute in the Zoom era of COVID. And we're going to present inspiring stories of good wood from the Pacific Northwest. I'm reporting from my daughter's basement because I evacuated my home the other day from the fires in Molalla. So apologize for my surroundings. I'd just go ahead and introduce the other folks that are here. So why don't we go through that list. Lynn, my co-host here and a key organizer of this. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Lynn Morgan. I'm with Sustainable Northwest Wood, local lumber store here in Portland, and also a member of the BLA, Build Local Alliance, great group of people working together for more good wood opportunities, and really appreciate you joining us today.
All right. And then how about Keola, our host?
Hi, everyone. I'm Keola Swanson. I work with Sustainable Northwest and really enjoy the Build Local Alliance community. I wish we could be in person, but very excited. Thank you to Glenn and Lynn for putting this on. It's great.
And Keola is hosting the Zoom itself. And we have also helping us out, we have Brandy. Could you introduce yourself, monitoring our chat?
Hi, I'm Brandy Safel. I'm the Forest Conservation Specialist at Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District, and I'm also part of the Build Local Alliance community and excited to be here. And
then Lizzie.
Great, thank you. I'm Lizzie Marsters. I work with World Resources Institute, and I'm going to be monitoring the chat with Brandy, and excited to be here and excited to see you all and hear about some good wood stories.
All right, and thank you for that. And after this introduction, we're going to hear the good wood stories from our presenters, and we're going to let them tell their stories and save the questions and comments for the end. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentations, but type your questions or comments in the chat box as they occur to you. And Brandy, Keola, and Lizzie will be kind of minding that, and then we'll talk about them at the end in the Q&A session, and then we'll continue during Q&A, I think, using the chat, just so we don't get confused by people raising hands or other ways of, we'll just start with the chat and maybe put you on the spot to ask your question once we capture it from the chat. So the Build Local Alliance is all about bringing people and organizations together around connecting good wood from local trees and forests with the local projects using that wood. So each of our speakers today has their own perspective on what is good wood that they're going to share with us. And we're here to just share and celebrate good wood and their stories. And we particularly want to invite you to join the conversation and the efforts of the Build Local Alliance if you are interested in doing so. Before we get started, we have a poll. And so I'm going to go back to my Zoom and start the poll and see how that works. So you're going to see a poll, and if you would just take a moment and answer. You can have more than one answer. So how do you identify yourself and your role in the community? And we'll just see how those come in, and then I'll share those results. And that way our speakers, all of us, we can just see who we all are and who's here. And I can kind of tell the participation. So there's now 78% participation. That's good. The hosts don't get to participate, but all right. Hey, we're going for 100.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're about done. This is your last chance. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and I'm going to share the results. So you should all be able to see the results. Can you see the results? Let's see, Keola, can you see those results?
I can.
Okay, good.
Sorry,
I
I
just
was
want to make
nodding my
sure.
head.
Oh yeah, well I see I've got you behind the screen. So all right, this is great distribution, so pretty even, but I guess we should all say we're consumers, right? Everyone should be using wood, but the primary identification, forest landowners, foresters, processors, designers, architects, builders. Hey, I think builders have got everyone outnumbered. That's cool, because you're really putting it in the final place. So, all right, I just wanted to share that, and then at the end, we're going to have another poll, I believe, to see if you want to get on our email list. But from here, I'm just going to go into getting started. And so I think it's time for our first Goodwood story. So Lynn, why don't you introduce Ben Deumling?
It would absolutely be my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Ben Deumling with Zena Forest Products. Ben founded Zena Forest Products sawmill and millwork operations in 2007 with the purpose of finding better uses for the oak trees growing on his family's forests. Ben's family has managed the Zena Forest since 1987, and he has worked to build a business that supports his family while sustaining their forest, which happens to be the largest remaining Oregon white oak reserve in all of Oregon. His policies reflect his commitment to conservation, forest management, and incentivizing partners that are committed to retaining and restoring those hardwood stands. And without further ado, Ben Deumling with Zena Forest Products.
Thank you, Lynn. It's an honor to be here, and I'm excited for this group of folks. So I wanted to sort of posed with the question of what is good woods, thought, well, let's talk about where it comes from. And go ahead and go to the next slide. As I think about woods, can you go to the next, there we go. We're all users of woods. Especially in Oregon, our houses are built of wood, our furniture is built of woods. We use a lot of paper. If we start to really think about it, there's wood surrounding us. We are heavy, heavy consumers of woods, all of us here in Oregon. And next slide. I would make the argument that, slide. Next slide. Anyway, I'll just keep going.
It's advancing on my end. Sorry, Ben.
Is everybody else seeing a new slide, or is it frozen on my screen?
Wood is always a better.
Wood is a better alternative. Yeah.
Maybe it's just really slow on my end. Hopefully this doesn't cause a problem here. I would argue wood is always better than the alternative, whether it's steel or concrete or plastic or anything else. Any type of wood is going to be better, whether it's a brand new piece of woods or a reclaimed, recycled piece of woods. From the carbon storage implications of woods, from the carbon intensity of creating that wood product, from the ecological ramifications of a forest on the landscape, wood is always better than the alternative. Next slide. That being said, all wood is not created equal. And is the slide changed for everybody else?
It did.
Huh, my screen is just, there we go. Well, we'll try this. The next bit might be a little rocky, but we will try this out. So in the effort of trying to think about where wood comes from and what a good forest is, and a forest where good wood might come from, I am going to sort of build you a graph. Go ahead and go to the next screen. And this is, we have an XY graph. Next slide. And on the vertical axis, we have increasing ecological complexity. Next slide. Then we have on the horizontal, we have increasing short-term profitability as we move over. There is then a line somewhere about in the middle above which the forest would become Commonwealth positive. It would be providing more benefits to the people of Oregon than it was taking out of the landscape. Next slide. As we move to the right, at some point that forest becomes economically viable. Next slide. So all forests can be placed somewhere on this graph, and most of them will sort of plot somewhere in this continuum, with a wilderness area being up in the top left. It's ecologically complex. It is, however, not economically viable. It costs money to maintain wilderness areas. A short rotation plantation on the bottom right has quick short-term profitability. It, however, has very little ecological complexity, and one could argue that at many levels it is Commonwealth negative. The damage to the air and the damage to the water and the, sucking up, or releasing of carbon that comes from short rotation forestry is in many ways Commonwealth negative. Next slide. And then go ahead to the next one. So our goal really is to find a forest that is both economically viable and Commonwealth positive, that can have complexity and profitability at the same time. I wanted to point out this chart is courtesy of Peter Hayes. Many of you know him. Many of you maybe have already seen this chart more than once, but I find it incredibly useful, an incredibly useful way to think about what are the elements of a forest that would make the wood coming out of that good wood. Go ahead, go to the next slide. So as an example, I figured I would talk for a moment about what we do here at Zena. And this is Zena, and the Zena forest is our efforts, that my family's efforts to grow good woods. We are trying to grow what we call a resilient forest for the future. And resilience really is a big word. It means a lot of things, but at the root, it means it will continue to be a forest despite whatever disturbances might affect that forest over time. And this week, we are all experiencing a very dramatic forest disturbance that is fire. And when it comes to fire, the more complex and varied and diverse a forest is, the more able to withstand it and not be completely eradicated by a fire, but to be able to, grow back and still have a forest there after the fire has gone through. We try to manage for what we call complexity. The more complex the forest is, this is sort of ecology 101. The more complexity you have in an ecosystem, the more robust it is. If any one tree or one species is threatened by a pathogen or what have you, there are plenty of other species on the landscape that can take its place. We don't ever lose the whole forest for any one disturbance event. We do that by practicing single tree selection and taking small patch cuts. So we are trying to have continuous forest cover on the landscape. That helps to hold water in the soil, so that in these dry, late summer months, the forest is acting as a sponge and still slowly releasing water into the watersheds. We, in this age of climate change, are constantly experimenting and finding the right trees to plant here in the forest. And when you plant a tree in a forest, you're making some assumptions about what is going to want to grow there in 50 to 100 years. And in a stable, static climate, that's an easiest decision to make. In a changing climate, that becomes a very complicated question, and that doesn't have easy answers. And our efforts we're trying to find out what are the best trees to grow here. And we have doubled down on some of our, historically native trees, the Oregon white oak in particular, native valley ponderosa pine. These have always been here, and they tolerate a very wide range of climatic conditions. We've experimented with some Southern Oregon trees, incense cedar for one, that grows in a slightly drier climate, has been thriving here. These days, we're experimenting more with giant sequoia and coast redwoods, which show a lot of promise as the climate keeps changing. And it's an ongoing experiment. to put more tree species on the landscape to add to that resilience and that complexity. It, however, is a complicated and labor-intensive and costly way to manage a forest. Next slide. And in the effort to still try to generate revenue from this forest, even with our added costs of doing forestry the way we choose to do forestry, we built a sawmill and millwork operation where we're able to make good wood products and find customers who are looking for good wood. And I appreciate the BLA sort of using good wood as a conversation starter, because it's an important conversation and one that I try to have with customers on a daily basis, and explaining what we do and why we do it. And we make hardwood flooring, we make lumber and interior woodwork of all sorts that for residential and commercial projects out of the wood growing in our forest. And we also purchase logs from the surrounding area to help other landowners grow good wood. Without markets, there's no incentive to have a diversity of species on the landscape. And so we are providing markets for landowners who want to grow more than just Douglas fir, Oregon white oak, Western big leaf maple, Oregon ash. And as more trees and tree species start to age and get to maturity, I'm eagerly looking forward to finding things to do with pine, with redwood, with incense cedar, with sequoia, with whatever else we end up putting on the landscape in an effort to keep forest cover. Because at the end of the day, forests are the most ecologically complex type of ecosystem you can have on a landscape. A farm field is an ecological desert compared to any forest that is on the landscape. And especially a forest that has a lot of complexity in it, provides so many Commonwealth benefits to all of us Oregonians. And I haven't been watching the time, but I'm probably getting close to running out of time. So I will leave you with the question, where did your wood come from? And what is the story behind where that tree grew that is in the 2x4 in your wall, is in your table, is in your floor, is in your piece of furniture, it is in all the wood that's surrounding you right now. Where did that come from and what was the story? Next slide. And so with that, I will pass it off to the next one.
All right, just waking up my microphone. So David, you are next up. I'm glad to see you here. And so my pleasure to introduce David Maeley, and he's the owner of Milwaukie Hardwoods, LLC, and a local source for indigenous hardwood slabs and dimensional lumber, custom milling and log transport. And he's got a story to tell of urban logs to lumber. And David will be joined by Ken Vetterick, who is a fine furniture craftsman, and they work together. I believe David will kind of introduce Ken and tell that story. And I'd like to learn more about your background, David, as well. So at this point, I'm just gonna let you tell us your story.
Great. Hi, everybody. It's good to be here and good to hear others' stories as well. Milwaukie Hardwoods is obviously located in Milwaukee, and we are more focused on the urban forest, the trees that are coming down in and around the Portland metropolitan area, whether due to disease, development, or other reasons. Ken and I have started Milwaukie Hardwoods. We've been in existence now since 2015. Next slide, please. So I came into this as a wood turner, and started to have more wood than I knew what to do with. At one point bought a Alaska sawmill, Granberg Alaska sawmill, and my daytime job, by the way, is a chiropractor. So I quickly realized that the two were not compatible. Lo and behold, I was riding through Southeast Portland one day with my wife on a bike trip, and looked under some blackberry bramble and saw a wood miser mill. Next slide, please. And one thing led to another. When you spend a lot of money on a wood miser mill, you have to justify to your spouse now that you're going to actually earn some income from an investment like that. So we started providing services, including custom milling. We also provide log transport, which I'll focus on in a few minutes. We have at the current time 3 kilns. We're soon to have a 4th. And we processing and sizing and some custom custom woodworking. Ken, my partner, has vastly 40 plus years of experience as a woodworker, but also has been a mentor as well as partner in the process. Next slide, please. So the 1989 Wood Miser LT40 still running as well as it can. And next slide, please. We also have we purchased a Lucas sawmill, which has a combination of a slabber that we can do as wide as 50 inches slabs, 6-inch circular saw blade, and a surface planer. So between those 2 mills in our location in Milwaukie, we are either hired outright by folks to do custom milling. We do purchase trees from folks who call us. Next slide, please. When I started to do this, you quickly realize half the battle, half the challenge is actually transporting these large logs. So we now have a boom crane truck, a knuckle boom crane truck that we can lift up to 8,000 pounds. Next slide, please. We have 3 kilns, 3 dehumidification kilns. Ken has 2 on his property in Boring, and I have a 3rd in Milwaukie. We just emptied the Milwaukie kiln today. We emptied some large slabs beech slabs that came from Reed College. We got a call about a year ago to come and pick up a beech tree that was coming down, one of these monster beech trees with 72 inches at the base. And so part of the load today that came out were those some of those slabs. Next slide, please. And we're excited to, in the next 3 to 4 weeks, to receive our a vacuum kiln, which is going to really change the process for us, because to properly use a dehumidification kiln takes a while to air dry the wood. It takes a long time in the kiln itself, and it's pretty labor intensive. The vacuum kiln is going to actually speed things up for us. It's a much more efficient system, and again, we're hoping to have that in the next 3 to 4 weeks. Next slide, please. So we sell dimensional lumber of all mostly indigenous local species, certainly walnut, big leaf maple, white oak, just a variety of different species. Mostly, well, I said indigenous, but walnut, as we know, is not an indigenous species. So most of it, and in fact, all of it, comes from the surrounding area. We don't encourage people to take trees down just to earn money from it. We're often called, in fact, just recently, a big cedar tree came down in Laurelhurst, and it was about 23 feet of clear cedar, and we went out, picked it up, cut the tree, cut it in half, of course, and picked up the 2 logs. And this is where we've milled the wood, and the homeowners are going to have us build some custom furniture for that with that cedar wood. Next slide, please. And we also have quite a variety of live edge slabs, and again, different species. What we're looking at here is walnut turning and gun stock. Next slide, please. We do limited processing. This was an example of a walnut countertop that went in to a homeowner, came in, picked out a walnut slab, and we processed it for him and finished it. Next slide, please. And my partner, whom I'll introduce now, again, Ken Vetterick, who's been doing this for, Ken, you'll tell us, 40 plus years, I believe. I guess the last thing I want to say is I appreciate the opportunity. When I think of good wood, the number one thing for us when we're dealing with urban wood is ideally it doesn't have any metal in it. I can't tell you how many times and how many stories we have to tell, lag bolts and nails and bullets and telephone poles and bicycle parts, all sorts of stuff that comes in. The other thing that we're looking for in terms of good wood is, again, something that's come down because it needs to come down. It's somewhat ironic that living in Portland, we are we pride ourselves on being a progressive city, but the city of Portland, their forestry department, to date, and if anybody has any influence in the group here, we might be able to change this policy, but they're typically taking the wood out to Troutdale and mulching all the wood that comes down in the city parks and city forests. And it's a shame because there's lots of good lumber that's wasted as a result. So, with that, I will introduce Ken, my partner, and thank you again.
All right, Ken, are you there? Can you turn on your video and microphone?
I'm here. Thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, Glenn and Lynn, for hosting us and inviting us. And I'm not going to talk much about the furniture today, but more of my history in building furniture and what got me excited. And it was the early 70s. I was playing with going to college, and I dropped that for a while and did some construction. But while I was doing that, I spent a lot of time in the basement just building things with construction tools, and got very interested in it. Went back to Iowa State University and studied industrial education, and then went on to, I lived in Iowa at that time. The Amana colonies had an active furniture shop, and this is an old German community. So I got a job there and spent 3 years. And that's why I first realized that you could go out to all these farmers, because all the farmers were cutting down trees. Some of them were saving them up in the hayloft. So you could buy local wood. So that's where I started getting interested. 1979, I came out to Oregon just on a summer adventure. Fell in love with it. And in the early 80s, I was lucky enough to connect up with a man named John Economaki. And he's quite a designer. And over time, a company called Bridge City Toolworks evolved out of that. So I spent 15 years with John and Bridge City Toolworks. And kind of at that point, I had titles such as operations manager, new product research and development, but I didn't really build furniture at that time. Wanted to do it again. Got a job working with Mark Godin at the joinery, and spent 17 years with Mark. And during that time, I had to go down to Albany, pick up some walnut from Gary Goby. And I thought, how interesting is that? All this milling and this local stuff. And I got real excited about it. So I started going down to Scioto and picking up locally harvested woods. A guy down there wanted to sell a dehumidification kiln. And well, it was affordable. And I thought, well, I bet I could do something with that. And so I've been milling and processing wood since probably the mid 90s. And so that's kind of my story. You can go on to the next photos. And so I've just been building furniture over the years. And then this is kind of what I do now, and process wood with David. So that's kind of my history.
All right, thank you, Ken. You're really a kind of a grassroots and homegrown, you've been a local wood enthusiast for a long time, and you just kind of evolved that way, didn't you?
Yeah.
I was glad to see it. Well, very good. Well, I'm sorry to move on so quickly, but it's time to go to our next Goodwood story. And thank you, Ken and David.
Great. You guys hear me okay?
Yes, I can. All right. So Ben, thank you for, I have to introduce you too. So let me get back to that. Sorry, I have to switch my screen back. And so my pleasure to introduce Ben Hayes. And Ben's a professional forester and a member of a multi-generational family forest enterprise. One of the names I know is Hyla Woods from their forests in the Oregon Coast Range. Ben's also, I think, the newest generation of a long line of enthusiasts about family forestry and sustainable forestry. And Ben's father, Peter Hayes, one of the founders of the Build Local Alliance. So he's going to tell us about From Forest to Frame and what he calls Hyla huts, prefab timber frame kits. And he posed a question, who doesn't want a magical cabin built from local wood? And Hyla huts is set out to do that from the wood from their forest. So Ben, why don't you tell us your story?
Great. So thanks for the introduction, Glenn, and thanks to BLA for putting this together. I'm going to walk through in the time we have both a little bit about forests and a little bit about the current project that we're working on. So we're going to start with silviculture, which is the science of how we manage forests, and really build off of what Ben Deumling talked about in terms of how do you get to forests that are both Commonwealth positive and building ecological complexity while also providing financial revenue to the landowner as well as economic benefit to the community. And the 6 different points are really split between kind of the 3 main tenets of sustainability, for however much a buzzword it is, thinking about ecology, community, and then social aspects. And to me, good wood needs to meet all 3 of those. That if you're purely a conservation property and focused on the ecological, there's a risk of the other 2 falling off. So it's a question of how do you accomplish something that is building ecological complexity, economically viable, and part of the social fabric of a place. And right now, what's happening in Oregon is a unique example of kind of when the role forests play in the social fabric of the Northwest. So you can go to the next slide. So in terms of silviculture, silviculture is the science of growing and practice of growing forests and harvesting and regenerating forests. And our primary objectives with the silviculture that we practice is to practice silviculture that suits the place. So not everything is an 80-year rotation, not everything's a 40-year rotation, that it needs to be an iterative process that is suited to the place. And great examples of this is Zena Forest, which is managed towards oak. We have a forest named Mount Richmond that's very similar, but it's much more of an oak woodland. And so the management there will look very different from a forest we have near the coast, where this photo is taken. That's primarily Doug fir forest, much older with a lot of water through it. And so our silvicultural decisions need to reflect both the realities of the present day and the present place, but also what's this place going to look like in 50 years and 100 years, and asking those questions in a thoughtful way. Next slide. Harvest plays a really important role in this, and we're lucky that we have forests that have quite a bit of timber on them currently, but that timber is Douglas fir. That across the western portions of the state, we've ended up with a situation where we have kind of Doug fir monoculture stands. So as Ben Deumling described, forests that lack complexity and are oriented towards a single value, which is financial return. And the way we can accelerate that towards a more complex state in most of our land is through commercial thinning. So we often do a first entry thinning, which is pretty small trees. They often go to chip and saw mills that are making like a stud. Second entry thinning and third entry thinning, which is pretty unusual. And then at that point, we move to individual tree selection and other kind of silvicultural methods. This is an image of a unit that we completed last year. And actually some of the logs from this ended up in Hyla huts. And we do that using pretty high-tech equipment and trying to have as little impact on the ground as possible. So soil compaction is a primary goal, which is why we use the equipment we do. This results in logs, and based on what I've described, most of those logs are Douglas fir, and historically they've been sent overseas, for instance, to Asia with a lot of the wood we have. And I got really interested in how do we keep more of this wood locally. We have a sawmill and dry kiln. We primarily focus on the hardwood species, which make up less than 10% of our total volume and significantly less than 10% of our growth. And our goal is always to harvest less than we're growing in terms of contributing net carbon sequestration. And so we started looking at with this Doug fir, if we're going to harvest it, what can we do? And if you go to the next slide, we've ended up, this is actually a bad example. This is not Douglas fir, this is grand fir, and very low quality grand fir at that. We ended up looking at creating a line of prototype kind of timber frame cabins. We built a couple over the last few years, and this is kind of the final social piece of how do you tell the story of where wood comes from. If you're going to Home Depot to buy decking, it's really hard to make that decision of, oh, do I want to buy something different? Where did this come from? But if you're, for instance, going to buy 20 acres and build a little cabin, or right now, if you have a backyard and it's a suitable place for a small office that you could buy and put together as a kit, selling that final product is something that gets us further down the supply chain and tells a different story. So we've started fabricating timber frames, and in general, the smallest one we sell is 70 square feet, and the largest we sell is 800 square feet. And many of the ones under 200 square feet can be built without a building permit in some places. So for instance, if you have a backyard in Portland and you wanted either a small sauna or a little office, or we have a size that's well suited to like a small classroom, that's really the focus, is things that are simple, easy to put together, and come fully prefabricated. So it goes together as a kit, comes with metal roofing, panelized walls, wood flooring, kind of the whole package. And it actually, in terms of the wood products, reflects the materials that we can produce from the growth on the forest. So the species are very reflective of, for instance, an oak floor that's a relatively small amount of the finished building, but is something that we are growing and reflects the place and the ecology of the forest that we're managing. You can go to the next slide. So these come flat packed up to 200 square feet. And this is one of the very first prototypes going together. And you can, with this size prototype, put it up with no lift truck or crane in about 2 days. So it's 200 square feet in 2 days is a pretty fast building timeline. And the smaller sizes are even easier to put up. So remote locations, backyards, and then also something that allows communities to invest their own personal equity in a building. So how do you connect both to the forest, but also not spend a ton of money building something? That housing should be affordable, and having greater access to the built environment is increasingly going to be important, especially for younger generations that are unable to afford a traditional single family home. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to sort of wrap it up there in the interest of time. This is kind of what our final kits look like. And I like this photo because this prototype is actually located in a forest where the trees were grown in that forest, harvested and milled nearby, and then assembled on this site. And so you see, in this case, an alder floor, Doug fir timber frame, cedar paneling in the background, and you're getting that full range of the species. 100% of the wood in this one is also FSC certified. So Forest Stewardship Council certification is a interesting and really useful indicator of certain kinds of forestry, and something that we value. So thanks everyone, and hylahuts.com has more info, and starting in October, we're gonna be taking pre-orders also for backyard saunas and offices. So start scheming on your location.
I'm scheming already. All right, well, thank you Ben, and we're going to move on to Nathan. Go ahead, Lynn, and introduce Nathan.
Yeah, that was great, Ben. I'm going to look you up for a Hyla hut for my backyard. That sounds pretty awesome. Thanks so much to everybody so far for great conversations. There's been some good stories. I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Nathan Dinihanian with Dinihanian Design Build. He's a local Portlander who's really focused on his affinity for Northwest woods. He strives to source locally and use FSC certified material whenever possible, and loves to collaborate with other craftspeople and local industries. He produces custom work of varying styles and construction methods, and received his BFA in multimedia design from the University of Oregon, and worked for a customer furniture shop in San Francisco where he learned his trade. And he's also a board member of the BLA, a new member for us this year, and he brings some new energy to us, and I'm really excited to introduce Nathan Dinihanian. Take it away.
Thank you, Lynn. It's awesome to be a part of this group. I joined the BLA. You could jump to the next slide. I joined the BLA last January, and that really was a really wonderful springboard for me in terms of thinking about what kind of work I was doing and where I was getting my material. So the first line in this page is good wood is rich in quality and character. And I think that's something that any woodworker or person that loves wood can identify with. And it's also a little subjective for me. That probably started, 10, 15 years ago with found pallets on the street that I could take home and turn into benches. And as my experience has kind of grown and my skills have expanded, my understanding of what is rich quality and character wood has changed. Joining the BLA and being a small business, I've really focused on the importance of sustainably harvested materials, but also being part of, the way the two Bens were talking about the complexity of a forest. I think about the exact same thing when it comes to our social networks and structures. And so I really strive to source all my wood from locally owned vendors who are kind of assisting me in themselves sourcing material that is sustainably harvested, so that when I have a client that says, I want something, let's go, I can kind of jump to my vendor and get to work and not have to spend months or however much time finding that material. So I really rely heavily on my relationships with my vendors. So we can jump ahead. So here's an example. This is Oregon white oak coffee table, and I had a friend who goes by the name Poost do the leg turning work for me. This was all sourced from Sustainable Northwest Wood. And the great thing about Oregon white oak is really popular right now, and Oregon white oak looks almost, I would say, exactly like other white oaks. And so it's not a big jump for my clients for me to recommend we go with an Oregon product. The other great thing about this is this table in particular, aside from the legs, is all comes from a single tree, which I think is, as far as aesthetically, there's uniformity there, but also I think it's a really beautiful, poetic result for that tree that has been turned into a single piece of furniture. Next slide. So in the last year, I've also kind of moved into cabinetry a bit and built-ins. And so this is a 13.5-foot long built-in, and I really wanted to have a single length countertop. I didn't want to have like a cross-cut seam in there. So again, I went to sustainable and dug around until I found two 14-foot 4/4 slabs and glued them end to end or side to side. And so I ended up with this perfectly scribed, near 14-foot long countertop. Next slide. This is a project I'm currently working on. This is my own kitchen remodel. All the cabinets are Oregon white oak. And you can see from the top of this counter in particular, it's a little more knotty and distressed. This is kind of like your not grade A oak. And I've also kind of used a lot of second tier material for all the cabinet fronts, which I'm I'm excited about, you know, usually people want something really pristine, or if they're going with like a rift white oak, just kind of knot free, but I'm really embracing all the cracks and knots and character of that wood. So this is another example. This is Oregon black walnut I got from Gobi, and this is for a record collector. So that's, I forget how many, that's 800 records or so is worth of storage. This is just an example of how Oregon walnut really is its own visual experience. Most walnuts are going to be, if you source like an Eastern walnut, it's your traditional mid-century medium brown in tone and kind of simplicity of grain pattern. But every Oregon piece is its own thing. So it's really a unique experience to build an Oregon walnut piece for someone, because it's oftentimes they accompany me when we buy the slab, because it's got so much character to it. We can go ahead. This was a fun one. I went out to the next slide will show you what this ends up being, but I was trying to find a pretty massive slab, and I ended up connecting with Epilogue in Charbonneau, and we went out there, we picked a big leaf maple log, and he milled it for me on site, and he was able to collect some of the slabs for future use. We can jump ahead. And then I ended up with this piece, which is 14 by 16 by maybe 6 feet, basically the big pith of the core, and did a little notch work on the bottom. And this is going to be like a beach house bench for someone. We can go ahead. And then here's like a built environment. This is just a garden shed, but I went and I went to the rebuilding center for this one, and they do a lot of obviously I kind of found material from Oregon, but this batch of cedar came from the East Coast. I'm not exactly sure about the story of it, but I think some of it was a little defective, so they might have just gotten stuff that the vendor couldn't have sold to people. I'm not sure. And then this happened in Malala. A family friend of mine, they took a tree down at a neighbor's house, and this is one of 3 logs, and we spent 2 weekends in Easter weekend 2019 milling this up, and now it's air drying, big 2-inch slab. So hopefully it's okay and safe from fire right now. But yeah, it should be ready in 2022 to start making some dining tables and sailboats and all that stuff. So that's kind of my relationship at this point with local materials, and just trying to, you know, I'm a link in a chain, and I really rely heavily on my vendors, and then do my best to, you know, educate my clients about the importance of this kind of work. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Nathan. That was great. Inspiring. And so I have the privilege of introducing our last speaker, Laura Squillace. Squillace. Yeah, did I get it? Yes.
You got it.
It's such a beautiful last name. I didn't want to screw it up. She's with a super cool company that we get to work with on a pretty regular basis, Green Hammer Design Build. And Laura's an architect at Green Hammer. Mm-hmm. And she collaboratively designs net zero energy buildings, ranging from single family residences to daycares and multifamily developments. And she loves designing with natural materials that sustain and celebrate both our regional ecosystems as well as our local green economies. And Goodwood makes all this possible. So Laura, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks. Can you advance to the next slide?
Yeah.
Hi, you guys. So I'm the last presenter, so we can have a good conversation after this. As Lynn mentioned, I've been working at Green Hammer, which is a design build firm here in Portland, for the last 4 years. And I joined them because they have ridiculously strong environmental values, and so do I. So it felt like a natural fit, and they've definitely become my family. And it's really a pleasure to work with a dedicated team that's just as passionate about doing the right thing with good wood and other materials. And then all of the great tradespeople and craftspeople that I've met through Green Hammer. It's also really rewarding, and I'm meeting more of you today, which is so nice. This is our team down at Opal Creek last year. So thinking about Opal Creek right now for sure. Next slide. Yeah, so at Greenhammer, building with good wood can mean a number of things depending on the project, right? But for us, more often than not, it means specifying FSC lumber and wood in general, like we did at the Fine Line House over on the right of your screen, where all of the wood from finished materials to studs was FSC certified. In fact, I think it won a FSC Design Build Award back in 2013. And we rely on FSC certification because it's basically the easiest way that we can be confident that it didn't come from old growth forest or a natural forest that was converted from something that was really diverse into a monoculture. It also gives us confidence that highly hazardous chemicals and GMOs weren't used on that forest, and that indigenous rights and local community rights were respected during the harvesting and management of that forest. FSC guarantees this for us and instills confidence in us, whereas its kind of rival SFI doesn't guarantee that for us. So it's kind of a clear choice for us when it comes to that. But sometimes for some projects like this one shown on the left at Lewis and Clark, it's a dorm lounge. Specifying FSC wood products isn't the right answer. Instead, in this instance, we were able to utilize the wood that was right on site on the campus that had been felled for future development, mostly maple and fir trees, to do both that mantelpiece right there, some furniture, some stair treads, and then it tells a really awesome story, right? Very similar to the stories that you all have been telling earlier on, where it's really representing the place that we are and connecting people to their habitat. Because it's really not necessarily about certification, right? It's about doing no harm, preserving habitats, and connecting people to our place. Next slide. Occasionally, we get the pleasure of working on some projects with clients that really want to go above and beyond, and Cowhorn Winery down in Southern Oregon is one of those projects where the owners of the winery really wanted to get certified through the Living Building Challenge's material certification pedal, materials recognition pedal, which is basically the world's hardest to achieve healthy material standard right now. But what it means is that all of the materials that go into that building have to be red list free. And if you're not familiar with red list free, it simply means that it's like a list of chemicals known to be harmful to humans and ecosystems. And unfortunately, most of our most common building materials sadly fall into that list, except of course wood doesn't. It's nice, simple, clean. And so we relied heavily on that material to clad the building and also do the interiors. But to create such a rich palette with such a limited material list, we relied heavily on different wood species and stains and different textures. So for instance, the siding is FSC siding, FSC cedar, purchased from Sustainable Northwest, harvested in Oregon. The tasting bar in the center of this space is also of cedar, but it's charred to a rich black to create that striking object in the middle of the space and really make a statement with it. And then the live edge table was milled from with Urban Timber Works. They garnered that wood from a heritage walnut tree down in Medford that was a hazard tree. And so we got some of that wood, and the city of Medford got most of it to create that live edge table. And then not shown in these images, there's a cabana structure on the back side that was made of juniper. And as many of you probably know, juniper is an invasive species in Eastern Oregon. And so by removing that juniper from those ecosystems, we help to restore that native grassland ecosystem that's out there, as well as boost that Eastern Oregon economy, and also help to reduce those wildfire risks that we're all too aware of right now. And then one other species that I could mention in this project is the floor, which is FSC white oak, which we've talked a bit about today, which is obviously as strong as it is beautiful. And by utilizing that, we help support those sustainable forests that are bringing back that native oak savanna to our region that used to be more plentiful here. Next slide. More recently, we completed the Tillamook Row project here in Portland, Oregon. We completed it in 2018. What's cool about this project is that it is the first zero energy building in the nation that's for the rental market. And when you call a building zero energy, in case you aren't familiar, that means that the buildings are producing more energy than they need over the course of a year. So maybe not within a day, but over the course of a year, it produces more than it uses. And so all 16 apartments are actively powered by the sun. And then of course they're designed to passive house standards to ensure that the envelopes are energy efficient. And then all 4 apartment buildings are oriented around this shared communal garden. And then there's that common house that's kind of front and center on that left image. That's a common house with shared amenities to support and foster community there. And so that the homes can be smaller, right? Because you don't all need a guest room if there's one large guest room, and you don't need a gigantic kitchen if there's a gigantic kitchen to be shared, and an exercise room, etc. But as for the wood, all of the framing lumber on this project was FSC sourced, again from Sustainable Northwest, as well as the post and beam structures that are at each residential entry and at the common house. We'll see that in the next slide in a minute. But what's interesting about when we think about using FSC lumber on a project that is watching the bottom line and making sure that we can meet that rental market cost point is that the cost of doing FSC framing was negligible. And it was negligible because we're already in the habit of specifying 2x8 studs for the wall framing, the exterior wall framing. And that's an unusual stud size. So it already costs a little bit more. And so the upgrade to FSC was completely negligible. And so what it means for Green Hammer on a regular basis on our projects is that it's a win-win. We get that extra thick wall for extra insulation and energy efficiency, and the cost of FSC is super easy to justify. Next slide. So going forward, Green Hammer's goals are that we are going to try to use FSC certified wood on all of our projects, from framing and, you know, from doors to floors to everything. And we're getting better on each project, right? Selling it to the client and really understanding the implicit cost that means. Our best understanding of cost right now is that it adds 1% to the total cost of a project if everything in the whole building is FSC certified, which I think we all here would agree is totally worth it when it comes to all of the beneficial things that comes with good wood. And then we're also, as a company, trying to really focus on redless-free products. And so again, wood is just that easy win-win-win where it's beautiful and natural and not toxic. And if I have one more moment, I wanted to share some emerging research that I've been hearing from my friends who work at the U of O inside of the Biology and Built Environment Department. With funding from the Forest Service and the USDA and the Tallwood Institute, maybe. What they're finding, they, like many scientists right now, are focusing on COVID research. And what they're finding is that wood surfaces in buildings are actually helping to prevent the transfer of COVID. And you can probably start to imagine why if you haven't already thought about this, but they're developing the research to back it up, which is simply that wood is porous, unlike stainless steel and plastic, which we traditionally think of as sterile materials for things like hospitals, et cetera. But wood is porous, and it also has terpenes in it, which are antimicrobial. So instead of the germ sitting on the surface and getting picked up, wood helps to absorb it and kill it. And so I think we'll start to see more and more of that research coming out, which is kind of cool. That's all I got.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Well, we knew wood is good, and now you've just given us another idea about why wood is good with respect to that COVID research.
Totally.
All right. Well, this is exciting. This has made my day as a fire evacuee in the basement. I've kind of been looking forward to this, and this is it is a very good way to end the day for me. So thank you all very much. Before we go into the Q&A and the discussion part, I have another poll to run real quick before we lose anyone. So we're at about a little after 6:30, but we've got plenty of time later if you'll hang around for Q&A. But Mike's next question is kind of simple, and we just want to capture these results for our records. So I want to see if you're interested. I'm going to start the poll here. If you want to sign up for the Build Local Alliance email list. And if you're already on it, that's great, or yes or no. And then that way we'll capture that. It'll go with your contact from when you registered for this celebration. So appreciate you voting there. So we'll let that go until everybody has a chance to respond, and I don't need to share the results for that. And then we'll go on to our questions. So, all right, looks like about everybody has voted. Okay, last chance. All right, I'll close the poll. And certainly recommend to your friends, tell the world about this Build Local Alliance and our Goodwood aspirations. So with that, ready to go to the question and discussion part. And we've actually been kind of extracting a few questions here. And I was thinking that there's not that many of us, so why don't we just let the folks that pose their questions ask them again, if they don't mind.
I can kick that off, Glenn.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, we had a question from Dean Moberg to the bins and Glenn.
Oh, it's Brandy, sorry.
Dean, do you want to hop on and ask your question?
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Brandy. And hi, Glenn and Ben Hayes. Say hi to Peter for me. So my question is, Ben Deumling, you talked about improving fire resiliency with diversity. And there's also, of course, a lot of things that people can do around homes in the woods, one of which, maybe not building the home there in the first place, but other things that can be done around the home to keep them, to reduce risk from fire. But what I'm wondering is, in Western Oregon, is there a place for prescribed burns in forests?
I'm not the expert on this. I'll take a quick stab at that. I don't know. In our forest, there is not. We are in the Willamette Valley, and this area historically was burned for millennia by the Native Americans, but that was a different forest ecosystem than the one we are trying to grow right now. And the Coast Range of Western Oregon had a very long fire cycle. Burning was not really part of the ecosystem. And so contrary to the lodgepole or ponderosa forest of the east side, where controlled burns make a lot of sense, I don't see it as it's not something I am pursuing. I don't see it as an easy fit, but I'm curious what other people have to say.
I'll take a stab at it since you put you pointed me out as well, Dean. Thank you for the question. I start with sort of the ecological and historical context. And so what Ben was talking about is we have a lot of native woodlands and forest types that were maintained by prescribed burning by Native Americans. And we have some types that would have burned more frequently due to lightning, such as ponderosa pine types. And so certainly we know excluding fire from those types means that they're going to change because they won't have that frequent fire disturbance. But then you bring in, what's the modern context of where they're located and how we can pull this off. And so on the one hand, I'd like to see us be able to reintroduce fire into some of the systems that seem to be well managed and maintained by fire, whether it was human caused or prescribed burning, or even just frequent natural fires. But then I look at the challenges of doing that in terms of our current setting. So I think it's worth looking at doing. It's hard to see how you could do it in some of the Douglas fir types that historically would have burned less frequently and more catastrophically, such as we're seeing now in some places. So it's a bit of a puzzle. I do want to see it reintroduced, and it certainly is being used for oak woodland management in the valley in a small way, and certainly in our pine types and other ecosystems. There are Douglas fir types that were naturally maintained by frequent fire in the valley, the Willamette Valley, although those were probably pretty scattered wolf tree kinds of old dominants with thick bark that were maintained that way. But it's a good question, Dean, kind of provocative. It's hard to see how to do it in some of the more, dense Douglas fir types, but I'm open to suggestions. All right, thank you, Brandy, for curating that question. And I think with that in mind, other voices, I see another question that Lizzie has. Maybe if you can, are you still there, Lizzie?
I am. I'm just slow on my mute and unmute button. I had a question for Ben D. I'm really curious with the affordability of good wood, and I know it costs, if you are as a landowner making this decision between profit and ecological wood, does it always need to come with a premium associated with that to make you guys whole, or how do you, what pathways do you see to decreasing and making good wood more affordable?
I would push back on that, and I think all wood is not as expensive as it should be. Wood's products in the marketplace, the costs are externalized for the most part. The costs from a poorly managed site of the water quality and the carbon emissions and the lack of ecological diversity and the firefighting costs from fires burning through monocultures are borne not by the purchaser of the wood from that place, that forest, but by us citizens of Oregon. And so all wood should cost much more to really pay a true cost for all of those things that are currently being externalized. And this isn't an argument for people to pay me more money for the wood that we make, but I think it's just a sort of a systemic societal thing that whether it's local foods or local woods that's grown and produced well, here at Zena, we try to not externalize any of those costs. We try to do what it takes to grow things well, and then we have to pass those costs on, and we operate on a very thin margin. And so I would argue that we really need to increase the price of wood across the board.
All right. How about Brandy, another question that you could curate?
Yeah, we have a question from Maya. Maya, you had a question for Ben Hayes about tiny homes. Do you still want to ask that?
I can answer it from the chat.
Okay.
Maya may have left us, so I hope she will tune in, come back to us, but go ahead and read the question there, Ben.
So I think the question was if you can put a Hyla hut on a trailer as a tiny home, and in general, know that the eaves are significantly, so the base structure itself is 10 feet wide and the eaves make it 16 feet wide. So you would need a serious oversized load permit. The exception is we have a 7 by 10 foot model, and that can be put on a 7 foot wide trailer with shorter eaves, in which case it's 8 feet wide, but it's only 70 square feet. So you'd be very, very tiny house living, but it could be a very nice portable sauna or office.
All right, so I see that it was actually Corey asking the question using Maya's computer. So Corey, I hope you got that answer, and you can connect with Ben if you still would like to order one of those huts on a trailer. Good, very good. All right, and then Brandy, you have a question too, I think, of your own.
I do, yes. I was curious if, we heard what David thought good wood was, but I was curious if Ken had a question, an answer to that question. So like, what is good wood to you?
Got on mute here. Good wood to me, boy, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm a hardwood guy, so everything is centered around hardwoods. I love attractive grains. The ashes, the elms, walnut, of course, everybody loves walnut. Good wood is something that I don't have to destroy things to get. And so I think that's about it.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks. What else have we got going?
There's one other question in here from Lizzie to the whole panel. Lizzie, do you want to jump on and ask that question?
Sure. I'm really intrigued about the innovation possibilities in your field of work. And so if you could change one thing, if you could invent something or change a policy, what would that be from your perspective? And I'd love to hear that from every speaker.
I guess we have to call it to order, so maybe we'll go in the order that we went. So Ben Deumling.
Oh boy, yeah. Hoping you weren't going to call on me first. I'm still thinking. The one thing I would change, I primarily work with Oregon white oak, and it is a precious and endangered resource. And I don't have time today to talk about how we saw an endangered resource, but we are losing, from a policy perspective, I think we need to change policy around the way we are currently destroying all of our non-dominant tree species in Oregon, and Oregon white oak being at the top. There's very little of it left, and there's continuing to be less every year. And there needs to be some policy changes, because I don't want to be out of a job in 20 years when there's no more oak left. We're doing everything I can to get more oak on the landscape each year, but I can't do it myself.
Thanks, Ben. How about David? One thing you would change?
Epilogue logging was mentioned earlier, and David, I can't remember his last name, but he's done a lot of work about the urban forest. And one of the things he introduced me to was that in Baltimore, they actually have a program where the city are taking the logs that come down from their urban forest and offering those for sale to the public, to whether it's a logger, a miller, or Joe Sixpack who wants to take a log and have it custom milled. I thought that was really innovative, and I wish that the city of Portland would be more proactive in utilizing the current urban forest, but also thinking ahead. And again, David from Epilogue really has done a lot of wonderful work on this, about how the urban forest itself can be a source of renewable, sustainable wood. And that cities, as they plan and develop, should be planting trees, i.e. Oregon white oak would be one of those, and looking at it from a 50 to 100-year perspective, that those woods can be utilized in those timeframes. So that would be the one thing that I would add.
Thank you. Ken, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I like what David said. I agree with him 100%. I would like to see less of the urban trees go into firewood and mulch. And so I think that'd be my thoughts.
Well, you all are working on it along with Nathan too. So let's see now. And speaking of, who's next? Ben Hayes.
I think that I'm going to kind of play off Ben Deumling's intro to this, that I would like to be able to go out. I think we need a policy change such that if I go buy any commodity log in Oregon, it is good wood and it comes from forest practices that make the world a better place, and make Oregon a better place. And there are a bunch of different ways we can get there. It could be straight policy. Lizzie Marsters can pull off figuring out the green tags program where we all distribute that cost. But as long as we continue to externalize costs to the detriment of a whole range of values, I don't see a way that we're probably going to change the system. That what we're all doing is important, but it's around the margins of a giant commodity market that is the driver behind forestry in Oregon. And that if we could all go buy any log or any 2x4 and it's good wood, that'd be a drastic shift. We need a lot of inventions to get there though.
All right, thanks, Ben. How about Nathan?
Hi there. All of the above. I think big picture, the work Green Hammer is doing, if that was just normalized, and that's either happening through conversations like this and people wanting to will it into being, or policy, which is basically saying this is how it's going to be now. That's kind of the back and forth that we're all kind of playing with. But yeah, make it normal.
We'll keep doing our share. Every little bit helps. So that actually goes to Laura, a good one to close out. What would you change, Laura?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you guys have said is spot on. I totally agree. And, you know, something that makes me sad is that, you know, Green Hammer is doing outstanding work, and yet we still struggle with these very issues that everybody struggles with when it comes down to the bottom line. We haven't quite yet shifted from like good wood as like the standard, and then you like downgrade. We always have to like, it's like, okay, let's spend that extra 1% to get there. So I really want to echo what Ben Hayes was saying. Like, if there isn't a choice between bad and good, it's just good as a standard, that would be revolutionary.
Well, thank you, everybody. Well, there was another question that actually Maya or Corey said, everyone answer this question about what's good wood. I'm afraid to do that because we're kind of running close to 7 o'clock here. So with that, I think that is a call for you all to join the conversation in the future. And we're going to have another one of these. So maybe help us do another one. What do you think about that, Lynn?
Oh yeah, I think we should definitely do another one.
All right.
Keep having this conversation.
And maybe the next one can be as much a forum as it is storytelling from our presenters.
Sure.
So with that, just would invite you all to join, and we're going to follow up with an email to all of you just to give you a chance to connect. And if you have questions about connecting with anybody you met here tonight, we'd like to provide that connection. And so for the rest of you from my coworkers here at BLA, anything else to add before we say goodbye?
I think we'll post a recording of today's show on the BLA website in the near future.
We shall, after we get that site going again.
Yeah, I know, I saw that today.
Yeah, but it will be there. And again, through the emails amongst each other.
I want to say a huge thanks to all the speakers today. You guys were amazing. And if I could add one thing about that conversation about good wood, I think the more we buy and the more as consumers we push for that to be normal, I think that we'll have a much better chance of making some of those policy changes happen. Create the demand for it.
Excellent. I agree totally.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm happy to report that I'm experiencing a west to northwest wind in my location.
Mm-hmm.
Might push the fires back on themselves. So with that, I'd say thank you all for coming and good night.
Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.